Okay, so have you ever, thought about just packing up and heading north, to Canada?
Oh, for sure. It's like this constant question mark for a lot of people. Like, is the grass really greener on the other side of that border?
Right. And speaking of greener grass, you sent in this awesome article, Living in Canada versus USA, a quick guide to the pros and cons. And it's got me thinking. This whole Canada versus US thing is a hot topic.
Yeah, for sure. It comes up all the time, and I totally get it.
It's a big decision. So this article is seriously comprehensive, dives into lifestyle, culture, even all those nitty-gritty financial details like taxes, housing costs, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive how much they packed in there. There's a lot to unpack.
For real.
Yeah.
So let's dive into it, shall we? Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to uncover some of those surprising facts and maybe help you navigate those tricky trade-offs that come with each country.
I'm game. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's start with our neighbors to the north, Canada. The article paints this picture of Canada with this amazing quality of life, friendly people, stunning scenery. Those Canadian Rockies, am I right?
Oh, absolutely breathtaking.
Right. Plus, they've got low crime rates, free education through high school, and of course, universal health care. I mean, come on, that's pretty tempting.
It sounds pretty idyllic, right? But like with anything else, there's always another side to the story. The article doesn't shy away from some of the challenges, like the cost of living, especially in those big, bustling cities like Toronto and Vancouver. It can be a real budget buster.
Yeah, I've heard those housing prices are no joke up there.
Seriously. And let's not forget those long winters. I mean, those are some serious snowstorms. Oh, and then there's those higher tax rates compared to the U.S. So, it's all about finding that balance.
True. You got to weigh those pros and cons. But it's interesting, though. The article mentions Canada was ranked the 13th happiest country globally in 2023. That's got to count for something,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. It says a lot about the overall well-being that Canadians experience. But then you come across this statistic. Over 80% of Canadians actually live in cities, even with those super high costs of living. Makes you wonder what the draw is, right?
I know, right? It's like, what's the appeal? Maybe it's those job opportunities or the energy of city life. Who knows? Maybe those factors just outweigh the financial downsides for a lot of folks. It's like, what are your priorities?
Right, exactly. Everyone's got their own priorities.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. The article dives into healthcare, which is always a hot topic. So Canada has this universal healthcare system where citizens and landed immigrants get free access to essential medical treatments, which is pretty awesome.
It's definitely a point of pride for Canadians. It's like this safety net that everyone has access to. But of course, no system is perfect. The article does point out some downsides, like longer wait times for those non-urgent surgeries.
Yeah, that's always tough waiting for important procedures.
I know, it's like the waiting game, right? And another challenge is finding a good general practitioner, a family doctor, especially in the bigger cities. It can be a real struggle.
I've heard that. It's like this weird catch-22. You have this great healthcare system, but actually getting in to see someone can be tricky.
It definitely highlights the importance of being proactive about your health no matter where you live.
So true. Speaking of proactive health, did you catch that part in the article where it mentioned that Canada has some of the most affordable gym memberships in the world? It seems like a small detail, but it's kind of telling, don't you think?
It's fascinating, right? It's like this little glimpse into the Canadian mindset. They're not just relying on healthcare when they need it, they're actively trying to prevent issues from cropping up in the first place.
It's like that saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Okay, so ready to tackle the elephant in the room, the cost of living. The article's pretty upfront about it. It can vary a lot depending on where you live, both in Canada and the US. But overall, it sounds like Canada might be a bit heavier on the wallet. What's your take?
It's definitely not a simple comparison. The article points out that while big cities in both countries can be expensive, housing costs in Canada have just gone through the roof, especially in places like Toronto and Vancouver.
Makes sense. Big city living usually means big city prices.
Exactly.
But the article also brought up a good point. While some everyday things like groceries and gas might be cheaper in the US, Canadians often come out ahead with lower healthcare and education costs. So like those social policies even things out a bit.
Absolutely. It's like they're investing in their citizens up front through those social programs.
Right. And speaking of investing, let's talk taxes. The article doesn't sugarcoat it. Canada's got those higher tax rates compared to the US. What's the rationale behind that?
Well, the article explains that those higher taxes in Canada directly fund those social benefits we've been talking about, that universal health care, the employment insurance, and all those social safety nets. Canadians pay more, but they also get more in return.
Right. It's like they're paying it forward.
Exactly.
Okay, but to be fair, the article does mention that the U.S. has lower federal taxes and a lower capital gains tax than Canada, so there are definitely some financial perks down south.
You're telling me there are definitely advantages to both sides. It's just about figuring out what matters most to you and where you'd feel most at home.
So it's not as simple as saying one country is better than the other.
Not at all. It's way more nuanced than that. It's about finding the best fit for your individual needs and values. It's like finding the right pair of shoes. What fits one person perfectly might pinch someone else's toes.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
So the article stresses how important it is to plan ahead financially if you're thinking about a cross-border move, especially because of all the tax implications.
Oh, absolutely. Cross-border finances can be a real headache. The article actually suggests finding a financial advisor who understands both the U.S. and Canadian systems.
So like a bilingual financial guru.
Exactly. They can help you navigate all those tricky rules and regulations and make sure you're covered on both sides of the border.
That's a great tip. Now, earlier you mentioned something about certain investments not being available depending on where you live. Can you break that down a bit more?
Sure. So the article talks about these investment limitations, like some investments that are common in one country might not be available to residents of the other. It's like these invisible financial borders. For example, there might be restrictions on certain mutual funds or ETFs depending on where you live. It all comes down to those pesky regulations.
Wow, I had no idea. So yeah, definitely talk to a financial advisor who gets those cross-border rules. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from lifestyle and healthcare to all the nitty-gritty financial stuff. What's the biggest takeaway for you so far? What really stood out?
Honestly, it all comes back to those individual priorities we talked about at the beginning. The article really drives that point home. There's no clear winner in this whole Canada versus U.S. debate. It truly depends on what matters most to you. Like, are you drawn to Canada's social safety net and that focus on work-life balance? Or does the U.S., with its potential for faster career growth and lower taxes, sound more appealing? It's a deeply personal decision.
It's about finding that sweet spot where your values and goals align with the reality of a place. Now, there was one thing that caught my eye in the article, and it's about that whole politeness factor. Apparently, Canadians, especially those on the West Coast, are known for being a bit more reserved, valuing their personal space. They even appreciate being left alone. What's your take on that?
You know, it's funny you should mention that because it's one of those things that often gets overlooked in these kinds of discussions. Like, we tend to lump Canada and the U.S. together as these super similar cultures. But when you really get down to it, there are some pretty key differences, especially when it comes to how people interact, socially.
Totally. It's like those unspoken rules of a place. You can read all the guidebooks you want, but sometimes it's those little things, those vibes, that really make or break your experience.
100%. And the article kind of hints at that, especially when it talks about the West Coast. It's not that people are being rude or anything. It's more about just respecting boundaries, valuing personal space. It's just a different rhythm. You know what I mean? It's not like that super fast-paced, in-your-face energy you might find in some U.S. cities.
It's like choosing your own adventure, right? Some people thrive in that hustle and bustle. Some people crave a little more breathing room.
Exactly.
Now, another thing the article dives into is career opportunities. And it does seem like the U.S. might have the upper hand there, especially if you're looking to make those big power moves in certain industries. Did that resonate with you at all?
It makes sense when you think about it, right? I mean, the U.S. economy is massive. It's a global powerhouse. So naturally, you're going to have more of those high-growth industries like tech, finance, entertainment, all that jazz. The article definitely paints the U.S. as the place to be if you're all about taking risks, chasing those big rewards.
So if climbing that corporate ladder is your jam, the U.S. might be the ticket.
Yep.
But hey, it's not always about the Benjamins, right?
Oh, for sure. And the article actually touches on that. It's like that classic saying, nobody on their deathbed ever wished they'd spent more time at the office, right? It's all about finding that balance.
Reach. Okay, so switching gears a bit, the article talks about the whole immigration process, and it seems like Canada might have a slightly smoother, more welcoming path to citizenship, especially compared to the whole H-1B visa situation in the U.S. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the article definitely highlights that Canada's got this reputation for being pretty straightforward when it comes to immigration. Like, they've got a clear path to permanent residency and eventually citizenship. It even mentions that permanent residents in Canada can apply for citizenship after just 3 years, which is way faster than what a lot of those H-1B visa holders in the U.S. have to deal with.
3 years, that's pretty amazing. I mean, that's got to be a huge weight off your shoulders when you're trying to build a life in a new country.
Totally. It's like they're rolling out the welcome mat.
Right. Okay, so one thing that really stuck with me from the article was how important it is to talk to a financial expert if you're even thinking about making a cross-border move. It sounds like things can get messy fast when you've got two different sets of tax rules and regulations to navigate. What's your take on that?
Oh, it's not a joke. Cross-border finances are a whole different ballgame. It's not as simple as just opening a bank account in a new country. You've got to think about taxes, investments, even estate planning, all that fun stuff. It can get overwhelming fast. The article really emphasizes finding a financial advisor who gets both the U.S. and Canadian systems. Like they're worth their weight in gold.
It's like they're bilingual, but for money.
Exactly. They can help you avoid those costly mistakes and make sure you're set up for success on both sides of the border.
That's huge. Okay, so we've talked about all the practicalities, right? The healthcare, the job market, the taxes. But the article also touches on this other aspect that's a little harder to define, that emotional pull that each country has.
Yeah.
That sense of belonging.
Absolutely. It's about more than just checking off boxes on a list. It's about finding a place where you feel like you truly belong, where you can connect with the culture, the people, the overall vibe, and sometimes that gut feeling trumps all the logic in the world.
Like that click moment.
Yeah.
You just know. Speaking of finding that perfect fit, did you know that the article mentions this interesting thing about Canada? Apparently, there's a big difference in vibe between Alberta and, say, the West Coast or the East Coast. It's like 3 different countries rolled into one.
Yeah, totally. It's easy to forget how diverse Canada really is. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of place.
Right. Like, what kind of vibe are we talking about? Can you break it down a bit?
Okay, so the article talks about how Alberta has this, traditional vibe, almost like an extension of some of those bordering U.S. states.
Okay, so like more conservative values, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Think family-oriented, a bit more traditional. Then you got the East Coast with those big cities like Toronto and Montreal, and it's a whole different scene. Super artsy, lots of culture, big business vibes.
Got it. So more fast-paced, maybe a bit more hustle and bustle.
Totally. And then there's the West Coast, which the article describes as having that laid-back, outdoorsy vibe. Think like stunning scenery, a focus on well-being, a bit more of a relaxed pace of life.
Sounds pretty dreamy. It's wild how much variety there is within one country. Okay, so choosing where to live in Canada is about more than just Canada versus the U.S., right? You got to find that regional sweet spot too.
100%. It's all about finding a place where your lifestyle just clicks. Before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to healthcare for a sec because it's such a big deal in these discussions.
Makes sense. It's a huge factor for a lot of people.
Right. So we've talked about Canada's universal system, but the U.S. system, with all its complexities, does have some advantages too.
Okay, so like playing devil's advocate here, what are some of those potential upsides to the U.S. system?
Well, for one, the article talks about access to specialists and elective procedures. In the U.S., even though it's tied to private insurance and all that, you often have a faster track if you need to see a specialist or have a specific procedure.
So it's like a trade-off,
Yeah.
right? Affordability versus speed, in a way.
Exactly. With Canada, you have that peace of mind knowing you're covered, but the wait times can be tough. In the U.S., it's more about navigating the system and potentially paying more, but maybe getting seen faster.
It's complex. There's no easy answer.
Definitely not. It all depends on your priorities and what you're comfortable with. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Canada versus the U.S., I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've covered all the practical stuff, healthcare, taxes, the job market, but at the end of the day, choosing where to live is about more than just those things.
It's about finding your place, right? That feeling of belonging.
Exactly. It's about finding a place where you can truly be yourself, where you can thrive, where you feel at home.
It's like that feeling you get when you walk into a room and you just know this is it.
Exactly. Sometimes it's about trusting your gut and taking a leap of faith, even if it means going against the grain or defying logic.
It's about designing a life you love, not just choosing a place on a map. Well, that wraps up another deep dive. We hope this episode gave you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to explore what truly matters most to you when it comes to choosing where to plant those roots. Until next time.